Well, here we are. It's 9:20. It's tough. It's tough. All right, just a quick review of the resurrection before we move into the next part of the creed, which is the ascension. And the review, I think, might be important because we need to keep some things in mind as we contemplate the ascension. So, as a review, I suggested that the really only historically plausible explanation for the rise of Christianity is that the tomb was empty and that Jesus was found to be alive by his followers. It hadn't been the case that they were seeing some kind of ghost. Equally, they really did see, touch, and share food with Jesus as a real bodily person. They had not, if they had not, they would have concluded that the tomb had been robbed. If they had, it's not just that the tomb was empty, but that they also had the experience of seeing him, touching him, and eating with him. If they hadn't had both, or if they hadn't had the latter, they would have thought the tomb had been robbed, which was actually kind of common in the ancient world. Not so much today, but it's not unheard of in our age either. Jesus' body was strange, right? People didn't immediately recognize him. He came and went through locked doors. He wasn't, he seemed to vanish into thin air on occasion. And these stories, it's important to note, they do not, the stories of the resurrection do not correspond to what first century Jews would have thought that the resurrection would be like. So you remember when I said that some Jews didn't believe in a resurrection and some Jews did, and those that did, what they believed was a general resurrection of everybody when God finally came and made the world right. They never imagined that it would happen to one person in the middle of history. They thought it would happen to everyone at the end of history. So the Easter stories are very strange, but they are not projections of what the early Christians had hoped for, because they couldn't have possibly hoped for what actually happened. Now, the resurrection appearances don't fit our categories for reality, the good Platonists that we are. We tend to see reality in terms of, well, how should we say, matter and spirit, or spiritual. This is this stuff, and the spiritual is something else. It's non-physical. But the resurrection stories describe, it seems to me, a person who is equally at home in both of these places. Okay, Jesus was equally, the resurrected Jesus was equally at home in both. Which I think means that we need to rethink what this is, the spiritual. We need to allow the Scriptures to inform our thinking about reality and stop bringing our own concepts of reality to Scripture. They are the stories that do reflect the Jewish understanding of an interlocking between heaven and earth. But heaven and earth are not like oil and water, which the Platonists in us we see these two things as not corresponding with one another. And so that at one level, to imagine that a physical person could be in this reality is a category mistake. But that's not what the Scriptures are saying. They're saying that here's this bodily person who is existing in both places and at home in both places. So I guess my point is, what if Plato was wrong? What if instead the Israelite scriptures are right, that heaven and earth are twin halves of God's creation, kept apart by human rebellion, and that self-rule became so powerful it continues to keep the two separate, effectively tyrannizing the earth, and with the weapon of the tyrant, death. And suppose then that the Creator God came in person to break the tyrant's weapon and inaugurate the new world in which the original purpose for creation is fulfilled. That is what the first Christians seemed to have believed. What we're witnessing in the resurrection stories is the birth of new creation. And that, I think, is the real meaning of Easter. The beginning of the kingdom. Jesus' risen body is the prototype of this kingdom. So the resurrection doesn't mean it's all right, now we all get to go to heaven. Although we do, that's not the point of the resurrection. It speaks of life. The resurrection speaks of a life that is neither ghostly or unreal, but solid, definite, practical. They are at the end of the Gospels, but they are announcing a new beginning. One where God is now in charge on earth as in heaven, and God's being in charge is focused on Jesus Himself being King and Lord. And this brings us directly to the ascension. If Easter is the prototype of new creation, the ascension is the enthronement. Jesus is the first part of new creation. Easter means that Jesus is the first part or prototype of new creation. The ascension is Jesus is now running it. He's running this new creation. In order to understand the ascension, you have to push aside your normal idea of heaven and imagine a biblical one. The normal idea being that it's some sort of a place, it's a spiritual place, and only disembodied people are there. That's what most of us think. Most of us think of heaven as a timeless, non-physical, immaterial, we might say spiritual, but actually that's misleading. The first century Christians thought that spiritual had to do with the work of God's Spirit in the world. And God's Spirit was most definitely working within this world, not apart from it. Just food for thought. That's the first century understanding of spiritual. So when Luke, who also wrote Acts, tells of Jesus ascending up to heaven in a cloud 40 days after the resurrection, and Paul writes in Philippians 2, 9 to 11, of his exaltation in heaven, the one thing we should not think is that after his death, Jesus is now going to heaven in the normal, modern sense of that phrase, as if he's now some sort of spiritual being. Now, I actually was taught that in seminary. The idea that what I'm about to tell you, if it doesn't rock your world, then someone has already taught you this stuff. But my experience is that no, people are not teaching this stuff. I was taught that the resurrection or the ascension was a metaphysical reality. And, the whole point of Jesus' ascension is that now He's in all of us. And He's in us by the Spirit. Now that's true. But there's a very important part or component of the ascension that is vital to a good theology of Jesus as the ruler of the world. But I'm going to get ahead of myself. There are 4 things about the ascension we need to remember. The first is that heaven and earth, in biblical terms, are not far away from each other. All right? Heaven and earth are not far away. And we saw this a few weeks ago. In Jesus' life, he had been the temple on two legs, right? He was already, in his life, an example of a place where heaven and earth met. In Jewish terms, the temple was where heaven and earth met. And Jesus went around acting like he was a temple. He was forgiving every time he forgave people's sins. Remember we talked about this? Every time he forgave people's sins, he's basically saying, I'm the temple, and I'm doing what only God in the temple does. I'm the new intersection. So Jesus' going to heaven isn't a matter of his disappearing into the distance. Jesus is rather like someone with two homes, which are right next door. So what this illustration of the proximity of heaven and earth doesn't really convey, though, is that they're not the same kind of space. But heaven permeates earth. You know, the word for heaven in the Bible is air. All right? It's air. Remember, there's a song we sing, "This is the air I breathe." Right? This is heaven I breathe. Okay? That's what the New Testament is trying to tell us about heaven. It's not, certainly it's not up there. It's nearby. The second thing is that heaven is, let's say, the control room. I'm sorry? Heaven and earth are, oh yes, thank you. Not. Thank you. Heaven is the control room. It's where the world is run. Now, there are some dramatic scenes that point to this in the Old Testament book of Daniel, and I just refer you to chapter 2 in general, where a pagan king, for example, is warned that the God of heaven is around. In other words, that God is calling the shots, so you pagan rulers need to watch out, because God is in heaven where he controls everything. Now, the third thing to say is, if they're not far apart, and this goes to the story of the ascension in Acts. This is really more of the form of a question. Why the vertical movement? Vertical. AL? We're not really helped at this point by some artwork of the ascension which has Jesus' feet sort of below the clouds. We're not helped by that image. So let me just say this. We need to remain open-minded, I think, about what Luke is trying to do in his story. Whether he intends to convey a literal account of this is how he left is up for grabs. It might very well be that that's what happened. But the thing to stress is that the vertical movement is not the point. Okay? Daniel 7:13 almost certainly is in the back of Luke's mind. I saw someone like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient One and was led into his presence. That's a messianic section of the Old Testament in the book of Daniel. So I think clearly Luke intends his readers to connect Daniel 7. And here's the point. There's a political significance to what's going on in Daniel. Remember what I said about what it meant to call Jesus Lord? It means that Caesar is not. This is the moment, Luke seems to be saying, when Israel's representative is installed as the true ruler of the world, with all the warring pagan nations made subject to him. How much he intends that to be us thinking of an actual physical event of him ascending is hard to say. But I think the point that we should take home is that we should not understand the vertical movement to mean that he's somehow located up there. Okay, I'm sure that's not what Luke wants us to think. And the fourth and the last is that anyone reading Luke's account and familiar with the world of the early Roman Empire would realize immediately what was going on here. And that is that Jesus is Lord. In a very real and concrete way. After the death of Julius Caesar, people swore they saw his soul ascending to heaven. And Augustus, Caesar's adopted son, promptly declared that Julius was a god, and therefore that made Augustus what? Son of God. Now Luke's story is not an exact copy, and he most certainly is not suggesting that Christ's ascension makes him God, or that he's just one God now joining another throng of gods in heaven, which is certainly what the Romans would have thought. But it is certainly not lost on any of his readers that Jesus is radically upstaging Caesar in this story. Acts is bracketed with this point at the beginning and the end. Remember, at the end, there's Paul, under Caesar's nose, announcing God as King and Lord, or Jesus as King and Lord. The whole book of Acts is the story of Jesus as Lord of earth and heaven, and he is sending out his ambassadors to make his kingdom a reality. And it ends paradoxically with Paul in chains, announcing that the Roman world has a new emperor. So let's be clear. The Nicene Creed separates the resurrection and the ascension. They are not two ways of saying the same thing. In other words, ascension is not a way of saying, oh, well, Jesus has now gone to heaven, to the spiritual place. Why is this even in the creed? And here's the part that I hope blows your mind. What do we believe about the resurrection? That's what we're saying. There's only one conclusion to make. Once you understand that we believe in the resurrection of the body, that Jesus was raised bodily, the ascension is not saying that Jesus has now given up that body and is now some sort of spiritual thing or entity. He ascends as man in heaven. And why is this important? Because here's why. If we think only in terms of Jesus' presence in us and with us by the Spirit, which is true, He is with us and in us by the Spirit. The Ascension reminds us that Jesus is also separate from us, apart from us, standing over and above us as Lord, as the one who is not affirming everything about us, the one who has something to say about the way we live our lives. That's why it's important. The Ascension is the corrective to the gross error of equating Jesus with the church and the church with Jesus. That error creates what Shakespeare called the insolence of office. When people nowadays, though, they associate, what do people do today? They associate religion with dogma. And I hope that there are some people who have that thought listening, watching this right now, because I want them to understand that, first of all, I understand what they're saying. That belonging to the church has, for a lot of people, meant assent to dogma. Of course, we have to ask, what do we mean by dogma? The paradox, the irony here, is that if the Nicene Creed is dogma, it's dogma that saves us from church dogma. Okay? I mean, when we get it right, when we understand what the Nicene Creed is saying, when we understand that theology, then we understand that the church is not Jesus. Sorry, Pope. All right, you got it wrong. The church is not Jesus. Jesus is not the church. So the church is not in a position to stand over and above everyone simply telling them what to do. Jesus did not send out His disciples into all the world to say, you can't do this and you can't do that. He sent them out to proclaim Him as Lord and Savior of the world. Now, I've said that the Ascension is Jesus reigning as Lord of heaven and earth from heaven. What I haven't driven home yet, and which I've mentioned, is that the resurrection of the body and the ascension has to be combined. Otherwise, we slip into Jesus as simply a spiritual presence in our lives. And that can lead to equating our own selves with God. And that, in my opinion, is the danger that is confronting our society in general right now, when people say I can be spiritual without being religious. I mean, to a certain extent, okay, I mean, fine, but it's the fact that Jesus stands outside of us, is separate from us, and is Lord over us that prevents us from falling into the error of equating everything I feel and think with God. And I think I see that happening. I see that happening quite a bit. Many years ago, there was a study done, and now I can't remember the author and the title of the book, but the book talks about someone that was interviewed by the name of Sheila. It's a fake name, but the name Sheila comes up, and Sheila created her own religion called Sheilaism. And then she begins to describe her. Sheilaism has a whole set of dogma, a whole set of ideas about God. That's what happens when we spiritualize Jesus and God and not remember that He is separate from us and other than us. What we tend to think is that when we think about the ascension, we think that Jesus, having been divine, stopped being divine, became human, and then later went back to being divine. And that we apply that thinking to Luke's account of the ascension and we say, oh, now Jesus has become spiritual. The resurrection of the body, though, calls all of that into question. Jesus is Lord in his thoroughly embodied, risen state. Now that's a shocker. Now let me get ahead of myself. Let me point out some things. There's hymnody about this, believe it or not. Hymn 215, See the Conqueror mounts in triumph. Verse 3. Thou hast raised our human nature on the clouds to God's right hand. There we sit in heavenly places. There with thee in glory stand. Jesus reigns adored by angels. Man with God is on the throne. Mighty Lord, in thine ascension, we by faith behold our own. Now I'm going to try to diagram what I've been trying to say. And as soon as I do this, it's going to... There's no way to completely diagram this. But in our sort of Platonic mindset, you know, here's earth, and this is matter, and somewhere is spiritual. Only symbolized by being up there. Wherever it is not this stuff. It's separate from it, and how can a bodily person even exist in the spiritual realm? Whereas the biblical image is more like this circle is not the earth, okay? This is simply a dividing line between matter, between our reality and God's reality. All right, so here we are, and here is Jesus. Who's now able to be everywhere simultaneously. That's how the physical, embodied Jesus in first century terms is able to be everywhere because of the tangential relationship between heaven and earth. This is not a non-physical reality. This is simply God's space versus our space. And Jesus reigns as man from there. Wow. All right, let me just stop and ask if there are any questions, because I want to make sure I don't get too far ahead of you. Yeah.
What does Luther think about this relationship between church and Jesus? Did he still hold to that Catholic belief?
Do you know that answer better than I do? Because I don't know the answer to that.
I don't have a good answer to that other than to say that what Luther initially wanted to reform were the abuses of the church, not the theology of the church. And I think that, don't look at Lutheran theology, but I think that Luther maintained some of that Catholic understanding right up through his death, in much the same way that Henry VIII maintained a Catholic understanding right up to the time of his death. But I can't give you specifics and I can't give you details from Luther's writing.
Right.
Except to say, you might want to look in the hymnal at some of his hymnody, much of which was written after he posted the 95 Theses, because his theology in his hymnody, I think, suggests the same thing. And what am I talking about specifically? A Christmas Carol call from heaven. him, the name of which is gone right out from the depths, I cry to you, or something like that. Look in the Lent section, look who wrote it. And a Mighty Fortress is Our God, of course, which is 688, is another classic example of Luther's theology. And I think part of the answer to that question you can find in some of that hymn.
Yes?
I really love your separation of church from Jesus, because it's the way it was explained to me a long time ago here, was that you never let a church or a man get in the way of your relationship with Jesus, that your draw and your involvement in a religious community is due to your relationship with Jesus, and that is an extension. I don't know whether you would agree with that.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I was about to add that what I'm suggesting, and I don't want to put this in like just my terms, I want to point to the hymnody as, first of all, a way of saying that what I'm talking about is not new. This isn't sort of newfangled, made-up theology. It's been there all the time. Okay? It's just that we are, as postmodern as we sometimes like to think we are still children of the Enlightenment. And, you know, what I'm describing, what the Ascension declares, defies reason. It defies reason. It actually wants to challenge all of that. Now, where I'm going is, if you follow the thinking that we've gone through in terms of the creed, that Jesus is raised bodily and he is the prototype for the new creation when it happens in its fullness. We haven't gotten to that part of the creed where he will come again to judge the living and the dead. But if we follow it, then all of the Christians who have died before us wait in paradise with everyone else for the day of resurrection. That the saints, for example, are not people who have somehow been jumped ahead and say, well, these are really special people, so we're going to just embody them right away, and then they can go to heaven. So now we can pray to the saints. What I'm getting at is a whole bit about praying to saints. In my opinion, it's just not necessary. It's not that it's wrong. I mean, we can pray for the dead because prayers are a way of expressing our love, and we loved our loved ones. Why not lift them up to God in prayer and keep them before God? Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if this is the reality where Jesus is now available to all of us, what? Jesus is now available to all of us, then you don't need to go through Mary or any other saint for that matter. It's not that you don't need to pray. I mean, it's not that you can't pray to them. I'm not saying that it's wrong to pray to them. I'm simply saying you don't need to, because we have a direct relationship with Jesus. Yeah, okay.
The diagramming of the ability to commingle or not between heaven and earth. Most of the conventional models, including going back to Plato, have the idea that the spiritual is able to penetrate the material. It's there in the Gnostics, it's there. But there's free traffic from the realm of spiritual to.
But it was spiritual traffic.
Right, exactly. But in your diagram there, you still have Christ surrounded by the Spirit, but he's punctured that. I mean, the puncturing of the ascension is the piece that upsets the articulated diagram.
Right. Yeah, the diagram breaks down immediately. I mean, I'm simply trying to. It's the only way I could think of to convey the belief that the New Testament has that the bodily Jesus is still able to be present to everyone, even though normal bodies can't be in two places at the same time.
I guess
Right.
forms.
Right.
But what does this do to paradise? What does this do to the in-between?
Well, nothing. That's the point. The point that I'm making is that Jesus is the prototype. So he bodily is at home in heaven in our diagram, in our one that really doesn't work really well, but it's the only one I could think of. Okay, and he's bodily in heaven, but heaven is tangentially related to matter, so he's able to be everywhere. Now, I forgot where I was going. What was your question? Oh yeah, paradise. So this doesn't change the two-stage process of death in Jewish thinking and in the early Christian thinking, that when we die, we are with the Lord. I suppose you could say even here in heaven. I don't know where paradise is. It's not purgatory. Okay, let me say that right away. It's not purgatory. Okay, heaven is a place of joy and peace and rest. In England, more so than here, gravestones still said, "Rest in peace." And if you look carefully at gravestones that are prior to 18th century Enlightenment, it's clear that those Christians believed that there was something still to come, that they were resting in peace as they await Jesus' return. And somehow, after the Enlightenment, we've turned resting in peace, and we've basically eliminated that step in death or life after death, and have gone, just sort of in our thinking, transferred it directly to heaven, so that we are now, disembodied beings in heaven, and that's pretty much all that we're going to get. But that's not the biblical teaching. So nothing's changed in that regard. There's still this time of rest until God remakes heaven and earth. And, however you diagram this, where, as you're talking about the holes punctuating here and here, well, all of this is gone. There just isn't any barrier anymore. There's no difference between heaven and earth because it'll all be united. But the biblical hope is that that union is going to be physical. Somehow it's going to be physical. I just rewatched one of the Star Trek Next Generation movies, First Contact. Okay, anyone see that? In First Contact, there's this thing called the Nexus. And it's this energy ribbon that sort of travels through space. And if you get caught in it, you are bodily living in this reality called the Nexus, but it's a place where time has no meaning anymore. Now, what I find intriguing about that is that physics says that the reason we have time is because we have space. And so space and time are two parts of a total reality. And that actually explains why, if you get on an airplane and travel across the United States, and someone rides a bicycle across the United States, your watches are going to be different. The person on the plane, their watch is going to be slower because they were moving more quickly. And I've heard it explained like this. If this is time, and this is my traveling through space, if I want to go, say, from here to northeast, the energy that I was using to go north is now being diverted here, so that, does that make sense? So that time and space, okay, well, time and space, Your clock is slower because the energy needed for the time is now being given to the movement through space. They're connected. That's what physicists say. But the nexus is apparently this place where there is a physical reality, but there's no time. Or time has no meaning. I just found that intriguing because that, if you will, is the biblical answer to what we can expect. I mean, right there, it's the biblical answer without the energy ribbon. Okay? All right. We'll come back to this. Write your questions down now while they're hot, and we'll come back to them next week.